So I'll get us started. I'm Erin Presley. My home department is English and Theater, and I'm the new QEP and General Education Assessment Coordinator for the institution starting this semester, so I'm still kind of learning the job. But really one of my primary responsibilities is to be a resource for faculty as you are with any part of the gen ed assessment process. So any questions that you have, feel free to address those to me. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to find the person who does and help you out as best I can. So prior to doing this, though, I was involved with gen ed from my very first semester here at EKU, teaching first year writing, and then was involved with that assessment process. And then I've served for the past 3 years as my department's assessment coordinator. So I have been doing assessment since I first stepped foot on campus, I think. So that's a little bit about me and what I do. But I have some talking points here, and what I'd really like to do is just to facilitate some discussion and get a sense of what your needs are and what's happening currently with your gen ed assessment and how I can help you. So, and also I think it's just useful to hear what the practices are in other programs and how folks are going about assessing general education courses. Some programs have assessed over the summer and they're already done, and I'm sure they're very happy. I know some programs are doing it this semester. Some may be doing it in early spring, but the reports will be due on April 2nd in the spring semester. So this is, of course, an opportunity for you if you're having questions to ask. Let me know, and I'm happy to help you meet that deadline. So. The other piece too, and I'll talk more about this later, Jill kind of hinted at it in her introduction, is that the QEP assessment is going to be integrated with the general education assessment. So we're currently doing a pilot this year, so with courses in elements 3A, 3B, and 5A. I will actually be sending a follow-up email. Lisa Bosley sent an email over the summer about that. I'll be sending a follow-up email about that over the next couple of days for folks who are teaching courses in those elements about developing a critical reading activity to help assess the new QEP. So lots of exciting stuff happening on those fronts. Okay, so the key points here then, kind of just boiled it down to 3. We just talked some about just the primary goal of general education assessment and how that helps support student learning. We'll spend probably most of our time on the second 2, the actual process, what that looks like. I'm very curious to hear what that looks like for your programs. And then also thinking about that really important piece of closing the loop. So you do the scoring, you have the information, maybe you're already sharing it with your faculty, which is good, but then what are you doing after that, right? Like, what are you doing to actually make sure that that you're helping students learn? So, and I'm sure some of you already have great practices in place, and I'm excited to hear about that. But that's just kind of a preview of what we'll be focusing on during our time together today. So I just copied and pasted part of the mission statement from the general education website here. But the main takeaway is the goal is to improve student learning, right? So it's to help our students become independent thinkers. Of course, with the previous QEP, that was tied to critical and creative thinking. We're building on that now and going to add that critical reading piece as well, but that is an important part of helping students be independent thinkers, right? And productive members of a democratic society. So who knew that this could be so political, right? But now it is, so there's that. But I think that it's important to revisit this because I know in my own experience as my department's assessment coordinator, I think sometimes, and maybe I felt this way before too, so I'm not just saying it's those other folks, but that it can feel like it's extra work, right? It can be a lot of work doing an assessment and doing it well. So I think it's helpful, for me at least, to take a step back and think about, like, well, why are we being asked to do this? And it's not punitive, right? It's to help us be reflective about our own practices and to make sure that that we're doing the best that we can for our students to help them become productive, independent thinkers, right? So I think that's helpful for me, and hopefully that will be helpful for y'all, especially if you haven't done your scoring sessions yet, because I know that can be, I know first year writing has that coming up, so it might be helpful just to remind ourselves of that, right? that it's not punitive, that there's a good reason that we're doing this work. So here I have just a few sort of vague bullet points. And this is where I really want to hear from you, and I think this could be an interesting place to talk about ways the library might be able to interact with supporting student learning in general education courses. And I'll just start with an example from first year writing, because that's the program that I know best and that I've been most consistently involved with the assessment of. And so Jill and I, we got involved with that assessment process back in 2012, right? So it was like the end of our first year at UKU, so that we were charged with that responsibility. And so what we found was that students weren't doing very well with information literacy. That was the real problem. And of course, for first year writing, the class that's assessed is English 102, which is now called research. Research writing. Research writing and rhetoric. I was getting ready to mix it up, so thank you. I'm glad you're here. So there's a real emphasis on research in that course. So students are not doing well on the information literacy part. That's a problem, right? There's something that needs to be addressed. So we saw that as an opportunity then to reach out and to the library. So we work closely with Trina Napier to really beef up our professional development on that front, and to also encourage faculty to go beyond the one required library instruction session and do additional library instruction sessions. And I'm really condensing like all of the work that went into this. There was a ton of work, but what we found in the next round of assessment and the subsequent one was that students were doing much better in terms of information literacy. And I think that was a direct result of the partnership with the library and being in dialogue with them. And also we did some work with the Null Studio, so that it was really this trilateral approach to helping students do better in these really foundational areas, right? Because we all know that 102, it's a prereq for lots of courses, so that was something that we saw a way to close that loop, right? So we saw what the issue, we did the assessment, we saw what the issue was, we shared it with our department, and then came up with an approach to help support student learning, so which I think has been quite successful, right? Would you add anything to that, Jill? I know I really condensed all of it.
Yeah, it's great.
So, okay. so that's just sort of one example of a potential way to collaborate with a great resource that we have on campus, right? The library. Also, I know Communications, I think, has done a pretty exciting collaboration with the Null Studio. Is that correct? Or did you say that?
You're talking about in the public speaking and
Yes.
but I don't know anything about that.
You don't know
except that they turned in their report to you on Friday.
They did. It's very exciting. Yeah, I think they were very happy about that. So, so I heard a little bit about that from John Strada, was at the previous workshop, and it sounds like for the public speaking course, which also has a lot of students, right? That's a really big chunk of our student population taking that class. That they saw that the accessible piece is a video that students submit for they're giving a speech, and apparently most of them weren't doing so well. I think those aren't John's words. He was maybe a bit more blunt about it, they did a collaboration with the studio here with doing workshops in the classes with students, and they've seen, I think, some pretty substantial improvements in terms of that accessible piece that students submit. So I think those are just a couple of examples of ways that you can support student learning, and with perhaps a specific focus on the accessible piece, right? Like what is it that you're assessing from those courses? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Anything else that you all are already doing that you think is helpful to, like maybe you've already seen a gap with the gen ed results from maybe a previous reporting cycle, and you have something in the works now to help students do better? And kind of related to that too, maybe, just again going back to the studio here and the libraries, which I think are two of our greatest resources on campus, that I think a lot of those sections are like evening sections or might be online, that sort of thing. And especially if they're being taught by part-time instructors, they may not know that they could still have access to the resources, and especially in the libraries, right? Because I know that some of the libraries will do workshops for the evening classes and that sort of thing. So, so that there are, that those options are also available to the classes that may not be taking place during business hours on campus, right? So that's important to know as well. The last one here, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but it's just sort of something to start thinking about in conversations that have been taking place with folks who are involved in assessment from the Office of Institutional Effectiveness, is that we're thinking more of how to see general education in the programs, right? That they're not just these standalone things. That that we should also be thinking about how they fit into a program of study. So Jackie J, I think, maybe has been talking about that in the workshops that she's been doing, and then we'll also be thinking about doing workshops on that front, perhaps in the spring semester or next fall. So just so really thinking about it in terms of the narrative, like what's our story, like how do these classes, we don't want to think of them as just these just add-ons, these standalone things, right? But that they're connected to the home department as well, right? So that's maybe just something to be thinking about, not worrying about, but just kind of thinking about at this juncture. Okay, so some dates. I'm a visual person. Like I have to see things in writing before it sinks in. So I think sometimes people get confused with the process, just when things are happening. So of course, last academic year was the collection year. We're in the reporting year. And then just to reiterate, we're also in a pilot year for the courses in 3A, 3B, and 5A for that critical reading activity. If I'm not mistaken, all of the other elements will start piloting a critical reading activity in 2019. So that's coming. So that's something to think about. I know Jill and Lisa Bosley and I, like, we sort of talked about doing some workshops in the spring semester, kind of specifically for the folks who are in this current pilot, but also inviting people who are teaching in the other elements who are just interested and want to, maybe you're a planner and you want to go ahead and start thinking about that and working on that, just so that there's plenty of support in place for creating this critical reading activity for your gen ed course. This is where I'm going to spend maybe most of our time that we have left together this morning, and that's talking about the actual process of scoring, writing the reports, and then I've included documentation here. Don't let that freak you out. We're not asking for documentation this year, but it's something that I think is coming. If you've been involved with the program level assessment, like this past spring that we were all kind of scrambling to get documentation for the reports that went into TrackDAT. If you weren't involved in that, then you're lucky. So count yourself lucky. But it was pretty stressful. Moving forward, though, that's just going to be the expectation for program level, is that there's evidence, right, for anything that's listed as a meaningful change. And my sense of it is moving forward so for the reports that'll be due in 2020, Gen Ed will also be asking for some sort of documentation. So no documentation for this report. That's the important thing, right? But just, I wanted that to be on people's radar so that it's not like, a surprise like what we encountered this past spring with kind of scrambling to get that evidence for those program level reports. So in any case, I want to talk a little bit about best practices, just reminding you where the rubrics are, also showing you just some resources that are on the Gen Ed website, which is, I think, actually, maybe as we speak, undergoing a facelift of sorts. So Bethany Miller in Institutional Effectiveness is working on that this week, just getting some things updated, that sort of thing. So that website will look a little bit different probably in about a week. And when that happens, when the changes are officially complete, I'll email everyone who attended these workshops and let you know that it's been updated. But the rubrics that are on there right now, I think for the most part, except maybe for yours, is up to date. And there's some really good resources though. There are some example narratives and reports, that sort of thing, that you might find useful and maybe didn't know were there. So just wanted to point that out. But I do want to just pause and refer to the handouts that I gave you at the beginning. So the first one that has the date on it and just says General Education Assessment Workshop at the top. This is just a super basic worksheet that I was almost embarrassed to hand out because it's so simple. But what I was finding in my home department was a great disparity in the reports. So Jill, I'll just praise the first year writing reports. They are always very good, and I never have to ask you for any additional information, and they're in the format that they need to be in, and it's lovely. You make my life easier. But then I was also getting some reports that didn't seem to be following any sort of logical pattern, wherein I was trying to divine I don't know where to put this stuff, basically was the problem. So what I realized was that some of the folks writing the reports hadn't seen this form. So this is what you see, when you go into Qualtrics, which is the system where you actually post the reports. This is what the person who does that sees, right? So I knew what I needed, but I realized oh wait, maybe they just don't know exactly what I need, right? So what I did was I just took the categories from Qualtrics and put it in a worksheet and gave it to the people who were struggling to produce a report that I could actually submit. So that was just a sea change for those people in terms of the reporting process. So I thought maybe that could be the case, especially for those of you who have a lot of folks involved in the assessment process. I know in some programs you may just have one point person, but I think in some of the larger departments you may have multiple people writing those reports. So in any case, I thought this might be helpful for someone else. So if that's the case, if I can just help one other person, then I'll feel good about that. So these are the required pieces of information that we're actually putting into Qualtrics. So that's something to keep in mind if you are currently working on a report. So and I think it's pretty straightforward. You can see that the real emphasis is on number 4, right? It's the use of the data. So and that's the narrative portion. So number 1 is how and when data were shared with faculty who teach the course. And that will be something that we talk about here in just a little bit as well. What does that look like in your program? And then the last one is that closing the loop piece, right? It's how did you use the data to improve student learning, right? So, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But hopefully this will be of use to you. The other handout ties in with this as well. And I think that this is probably one of the most common questions that people have who are involved in the process, especially if, and I think a lot of you are involved in courses where you have multiple sections, right? The art appreciation and your special education course, APP 200, the communication courses, and of course, first year writing. So these are all multi-section courses. So these are just some guidelines, and this was actually, this is on the Gen Ed website. How many of you use that, by the way? I'm just kind of curious. Sort of, do you just go there for the rubrics, or sort of? Okay, that's one of the things that I want to do, is like to make that sort of one-stop shopping for any general education type questions that you have. And I think that there's great information there, but maybe just need to, I don't know, promote it a little bit more or something like that. So I just pulled this from the Gen Ed website and changed my name on it because Jennifer's name was still on it. So hopefully she will not respond to emails about EKU Gen Ed assessment at this point, but you never know. So in any case, you have some options here for how to go about the assessment. Some of you who have thousands of students may be laughing at option 1 that you would use all the sections. Jill, are you about to just have a heart attack? So that, of course, is one option. And I think that one is more appropriate when it's maybe just, I would say under 10 sections, right? If even that many, because that would be a lot of heavy lifting, depending on the instrument, of course. Now, if the instrument is sort of like a multiple choice kind of Scantron situation, that's not going to be a problem, right, to do all the sections. But if it's looking at video of student speeches, or if you're looking at 8 to 10 page research papers, you can't do that, right? And no one expects you to. so there's the silver lining. So in any case, there's some other, I think, helpful information here. But option 2, I think, is the one, if you have an instrument that requires some heavy lifting to actually score, right, that you would want to follow these guidelines. And those, I think it's pretty straightforward. If it's 10 sections or less, you want to do 10% of students work with a minimum of 30, right? And if it's more than 10 sections, about 5%. So, and I know that's what first year writing does. And I think that it's still heavy lifting, right? But at least it's manageable when you do it like this. Another thing that I think is really important to note here, and I know just off the top of my head that this would apply to like APP 200, is that the sample sizes don't have to be the same, right? So if part of the assessment is a Scantron, like multiple choice kind of exam to look at some of the learning outcomes, you could do all of those. But then if there's an essay that's also part of some of the assessment, you could do just the percentage of those, so they don't have to line up. So I think that that's important information to know there. And of course, I try to put my email address on everything, so you'll know how to get in touch with me if you have questions after the session today. So then we'll spend some time then talking about best practices. And as always, I just kind of mostly want to hear like what's working for you at this point. Like what does your process look like? And then maybe I'll have some suggestions, or maybe you'll cover everything that I have in my mind as suggestions. But I want us to have kind of a conversation about that. What's working well for you currently with your the way you do the scoring and writing the report.
I have a question.
Sure.
And I haven't been to this training in a long time, many years. So we're allowed to use an assessment instrument that is also for a grade in class, right?
Absolutely, yes. And I think I think that works best,
okay.
Right? So, and I know just like the ones that I'm familiar with, like I think that's what everyone does.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you don't, right, the students are probably just going to mail it in if it's just this extra thing they have to do, right?
Thanks.
You're welcome. And it's something that I'll probably mention it later, but I'll go ahead and mention it now since it's on my mind, is that you can change the instrument, right? Like the instrument is not static. Like if you're finding that maybe students are just doing consistently poorly on it, or maybe instructors aren't super excited about using it, you can revisit that instrument and change accordingly, right? So I think that's, I think some people get in the mindset, it's like, no, this is how it's always been done and this is what we have to do. It's like, no, you can change it. So yeah.
Well, I'll just mention briefly.
Yeah.
So we have so in Act 200, which is our intro Appalachian Studies class, there's 2 instruments. There is in essence, a content knowledge 24 question exam that then there's a index score that we can take out of subsets of that for each one of the elements or several of the elements, and then there's an essay portion for the writing. And we have had some issues with faculty not being happy with the actual content questions themselves, and we tweaked and revised them along the way, but that was where we really discovered this kind of mismatch. It really wasn't the language. But the other thing we did with our instrument was it's not only our gen ed instrument, it is our program assessment instrument. It's where we look to see if students are getting the fundamental core information for the program. And kind of, I think that, and we did the same thing when we worked on the geoscience, an instrument for physical geography and for environmental geography as well. That seeing that instrument not just as the gen ed assessment instrument, but also as the basic program assessment instrument, our students getting out of this class what we as a department believe that they should know about geosciences or about Appalachian studies has worked very well for us. And when we go back and look at that, that kind of dual purpose of that instrument also, I think, keeps it out of the realm of faculty dismissing it and thinking that it's just an add-on, because it really is helping inform our programmatic assessment as well as our gen ed assessment. And I think to the point of assessment, we have to remind ourselves, while I love your kind of, this is all self-reflective business, we have to remember that these assessments are also about SACs. It's about reporting to external entities about the success of our programs and our colleges and university. It's about talking to parents and legislatures and governors and funding bodies, that it demonstrates that we're actually doing what we're saying we do. And that's a very important part of all of this assessment process. It is the way we communicate to external bodies that we are doing what we say we do when we say that we're educating their children. And we can't discount that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I like that you tied it back into, because you know, I had mentioned like the program level curriculum, like thinking about how it fits in, and yeah, I mean, absolutely the 2 examples that you gave, that it's not clearly this standalone thing, right? It's as a way to like get students in your classes, right? That it's very clearly connected to the program. And that would be the same thing for your course as well, right?
Right. We have the standard required syllabus because we're taught by so many adjuncts, and it's also a required course, so it's a key assessment for our accreditors to look at. So we are constantly doing inter-rater reliability and so forth for the big key assessment. Now the assessment that we use for the gen ed is a different assignment within the same course, but still it's mandated, everybody does it. And our instructors are just used to, yeah, we have to do an IRR on this because we have to do it, you know, so it does work very well.
How does art appreciation fit into your program? I'm just curious.
For art appreciation, at 200, it's for non-majors, because some majors do not take the course. So, however, when it comes to assessing the course, we still have to address what we expected them to learn in, art appreciation as well.
And maybe get some majors out of that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we're also in the process of changing our instrument. Because we were doing a comparative essay and the instructions weren't clear, students were approaching it differently. I think it was being explained and graded differently across sections. And so,
Yeah.
revising.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so, and something that we might mention too, because so obviously there are rubrics for the gen ed assessment, but also maybe going back to your question about, should this just be an assignment that students just do in the class, is thinking about like, well, how are you evaluating in the class? Like, is there a standard rubric, which I think can be very helpful when you have multiple sections, right, of the same course, and you maybe have lots of different instructors, maybe some report time, as a way to help guide their evaluation of that work and kind of set the tone for the expectations, right? And I know that that's been helpful in first year writing, right? Yeah, so, and that was a process. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think some of the recurring themes that I'm hearing too is like being inclusive, like including the folks who are teaching the class, that sort of thing. So,
With our first year writing.
yeah.
So a few years ago, Aaron and I sort of completely overhauled the program. We rewrote the course titles, the course descriptions, got new textbooks, and just really tried to work at clarifying and standardizing in some ways what was happening across all of the different sections, because there are so many sections of 101 and 102, and so many of them are taught by adjuncts, especially at that time, maybe fewer now. So we spent a lot of time doing that. And as part of the process, we decided that because there were so many sections, that we wanted a clear tool for assessment to be a big part of that conversation. So we created a rubric for 101 and 102, developed using our general education student learning outcomes to be a big part of the foundation of that. And involved not just us, we were co-coordinating the program at the time, so we didn't just do it and then give it to them. We created a draft of it and then spent several semesters with different groups piloting it, getting feedback on it, adjuncts, full-time faculty. Of course, we were using it to see how it was working in our classes as well. So over the course of several semesters, we honed it in and got it working for us. And then I've spent a ton of time doing workshops, creating examples, posting it on Blackboard. So now my faculty can go into our first year writing Blackboard site, and there's a whole rainbow of example student essays with the rubric applied to them, from a strong fail to every little half step, a D, a C minus C, C plus, B minus, all the way up to a really strong A, with descriptions for not just the grade, but with descriptions for why the rubric applies in a particular way to that essay. So those are available to them all the time, and we've done workshops, and I joke that I say rubric at every meeting where I'm talking about first year writing, or if I haven't brought it up, I always make a joke about how, aren't you happy we're not talking about this today, because we talked about it so much. And I think it has really helped to set a standard for the in-class assessment for the text that students are turning in. And so then that translates to our general education assessment, because we took time to make sure that those standards were very similar. So what they're grading in class should be what is also showing up as strengths or weaknesses in the gen ed rubric that we're using for our programmatic assessment. So I think it's been integrated pretty well.
Yeah, I do too.
And everybody's been involved.
Oh yeah. So I think there was some real buy-in because of that. Because I think when that first round that we did way back in 2012, it was just kind of all over the place what we were getting in that essay. I think it was pretty loosely construed what essay meant. And I think the last round, we haven't explored this last round, but the previous round, it was like, oh hey, these are all on the same page, and I think that it's a direct result of all the time that Jill put into the rubric and having those resources available. So, so in any case, I think that that's a nice way to integrate it, right? That it's not just this extra add-on thing that you do in the class, but that it's fully integrated into the course. And I think in ways that are meaningful to students, right? That it's going to help them.
Can I say something about that? I think one thing that has made our programmatic rubric work really well is that we share it with the students. And in the training that I've done for my instructors, I say all the time, it should be woven into everything you do. They should see it in the first day of class with the policies. You should be using that language when you're talking about the work that they're doing. If they're doing peer review with each other, then they should have that rubric in front of them, and that should be the tool that they're using to talk about their own work and their students' work. So it's not just something that a few instructors see once every 2 years when we're doing gen ed assessment, but it should be every day in the class using that vocabulary all the time.
Yeah, and that was another, I think, really meaningful collaboration with the studio, because they took it upon themselves, I think, a few years ago to turn it into a peer review instrument, and then that's something that now you encourage the instructors to use when they do peer review classes. So they start using the language of the rubric around, I guess, midterm, right? So, and I think that's not a bad thing. I think that's definitely productive. Just a couple of other little thoughts about best practices with scoring, because I think most of you in here right now are doing it's the multi-section courses. And I'm pretty sure that you all are already doing this, but just so I can get it on the video, I guess, is that that you make sure that you have, I think, a norming session is helpful. Just where you look at a few pieces and discuss with the assessment group what score you think that it earns and why. So really sort of like recalibrating yourself to the rubric, so that you're making sure that you're using the language of the rubric and that you're all kind of on the same page when you look at this and you're like, oh yes, this is a 3 and here's why. That sort of thing. And then also I'm kind of curious too, like how many folks are usually involved in that actual scoring process currently in your programs? You too? Yeah, okay, yeah. So, and it's helpful when you know the people and you work all together, right? Like that's always a good thing too.
We have 3, but any one student's essay, on the essay portion, we have 3 people that score them, but then they're mixed up so that any one student is only going to get scored by 2.
Right.
But they're not always the same pair, so that's one way that we kind of norm across the entire substack, is that we mix them up. But that was actually a question I had, or is, I think that it might be helpful, even as, particularly because we're so reliant on adjuncts, that in order to help them better understand the other end of how the assessment process looks, been thinking about incorporating more people into the process so that we have more readers. But I think it also then becomes potentially a training tool for them, because it helps them better understand the language of the rubric and may help them better communicate that to students. And I just wondered if anybody else had taken that approach, or, I mean, it would still probably look about the same, where maybe we would have 2 adjuncts and 2 experienced faculty, and we would still sort of crisscross pair them, but then look to see,
But I would just think, we have everyone involved, and we
Okay.
have to because of our accreditation. So we just do the same process with the gen ed as we do with the key assessment for our accreditation, because they all have to be involved. They all have to, we have to have 80% agreement across. We have sometimes 10 sections. Sometimes every single one of them is taught by an adjunct. So we're doing this constantly. And if they can't physically come to campus, because some of them do, they work during the day and they live out, they attend by Zoom. And I email, here's the sample number 1. Everybody look at sample number 1, score sample number 1. What do we have? Let's talk about it. Why did you think it was a 3? Why did you think it was a 2? And then we do another one. We do 4. We do the first one is called our calibration, and then we do another 3. And we talk about it and we get it worked through. But everybody has to do it. We can't do a sampling, We have to do everybody because of accreditation, so we just do the same thing. Same night, same.
That sounds,
That's helpful, yeah.
yeah, this is like a lot of work, right? Just a lot of coordination.
It's huge,
Yeah.
and scheduling it is a huge, just and doing the technology of, people who have to attend through Zoom, can they see us, can they hear us, and so sending the samples by email is one thing, but then having them actually connected and being able to participate in the discussion, it is huge, and sometimes we have to reschedule because somebody couldn't connect or something, so we have to reschedule. So,
Yeah.
but that's the way it is.
Yeah, but I can see that even though that is a ton of work, a ton of heavy lifting, I can see like the real advantages to that though, that, so everyone's invested,
Yes,
right?
they are invested.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we have a lot of returns of adjuncts, but every time there's at least one or two
Right.
new coming in, so they get into the, the whole culture of this is how it's done, and this is, it's not a create your own course. It's not scored the way you want to, or, it's mandated. We have to do it the same.
okay, so then here's the part where I'm going to talk about the third key point, which is closing the loop, right? So it's like, so we've done, you've got your data, now what do you do with it? And these are things that, some of these I heard from the first workshop that I did a few weeks ago on the Gen Ed assessment. Some of them are just things that we do in English that I think work pretty well. So some of this may be like, oh yeah, I already do that. So what I'm really interested in is adding to my list. So what are some things that maybe you've done in your program that you think has worked really well to address that, the most important part, right? It's like, okay, so we've got this information, now what do we do with it, right? What are we going to do to take it back into the classroom and help students? So you can kind of just see these, but I know some departments have work groups that are focused on assessment. And I think this is primarily in departments where you have multiple faculty teaching the Gen Ed course. And I think that could be really helpful. Something that we do in English, and that I'm sure lots of you do in your programs, is sharing those results during Assurance of Learning Day, or having some time devoted to actually doing the work during Assurance of Learning Day. So again, emphasizing the reflection process and really going back to the previous report. I think that's really key to think about, like, okay, where were we 2 years ago, and what does this data say to that, right? So putting those, the new information in the conversation with the previous report. And I've already mentioned this, but I think it bears repeating. It's just being willing and open to maybe revisit the instrument that you're using. If it's something that, like Alice was saying, that maybe a lot of the faculty didn't like just the language, right? Just at the level of the way the questions were being worded, that's something that you can change pretty easily, right? And also I think it's a good opportunity to get buy-in and participation from part-time instructors who may be teaching the course as well. What are some other things that you all do with the information once you have it?
I'll just share one thing we did. I think it was 2 years ago, that it used to be that the students were required to go to an educational setting and observe students identified with disabilities being active in a classroom. Well, the problem with that was the observations were very mixed. You had no quality control over what they were seeing. And sometimes you wondered when you read the essay, did they even just make this up? Did they really go to a school and see something? So the instructors, the faculty, full-time faculty, came up with a variety of videos of approximately an hour of various disabilities, various settings, and so forth. And the students could select from that group, select one for the first iteration of the assignment. Then they had targeted feedback from the instructors, and the one that we collected data on is observation number 2. So they select a different video from that same group. So the instructor knows what they should see, they know what they should be getting out of it, they know what they're looking for. So the quality is more even, and then plus, because they've done it a first time and gotten targeted feedback, because we know what we want them to get out of the videos, then the quality of the second one is better, and then that's the one we collect our data on. So that's how we have approached that.
Yeah, that's a great example. So see, I would love to capture like these various great examples that I've heard and include this on the Gen Ed website, like as resources, so that people aren't constantly like reinventing the wheel, right? So even if that's, you're in a different program, there might be something you could take from that and use to maybe rethink your own instrument or some part of the process. That's great.
This is maybe more a question than a share. One of the things that we've struggled with the Act 200, because it counts for the diversity requirement. Diversity is one of the Gen Ed requirements that is required to assess communication effectiveness. And so the pushback that I get from my faculty is, I've got all this content to get through. It's not. How do I teach basic writing when that's not my skill set? It's not my background. It's also what I don't have time for. But in the end, the students are in fact getting assessed on their ability to write. So because that's part of the assessment. And I think that some of these things have helped. That is just having faculty talk about what they do and how they, make sure that you have at least one writing assignment earlier in the semester in which you are actually applying the rubric that will be applied. Apply that earlier so that they have at least one sample set, if not more, in that class prior to the one that's assessed. But I think particularly in a class where that's not the primary focus of the class, but it still ends up being one of the things we're required to assess. I would love to see or hear how other departments and how other units are dealing with that and how they're not just structuring their general assessment process, but how they're structuring teaching their class in order to infuse or incorporate that in an appropriate way.
I know one of the things I did when I taught the class was they did a peer review. Like we did, and it didn't take the whole class period, it took half of the class period to do it. And also I think another thing that was transformative for that assessment is that they're now required to have time outside of class. Because I think some people were doing it as writing on demand, which made my head want to explode. So, because you're not going to get the kinds of writing that you want to assess out of that, right? That's not a best practice for students. But I think just building that time in to even just like one class period to have that time. And also, as you mentioned, taking what Karen said about making sure that they've received some feedback at some point before they do that, I think is really, really helpful for students, because then they have a sense of what the expectations are, right? So, and they have time to come by your office and talk about it, or come to the studio and get help if that seems appropriate for them. Okay, so we are almost completely out of time, but just kind of looking ahead, as I've already mentioned, QEP is going to be assessed through the Gen Ed courses. 3A, 3B, 5A are in a pilot year right now. The rest of the elements will be in the pilot starting in 2019. And we'll have lots of information about that. As I think I already mentioned, planning on doing some workshops on that in the spring semester. So there's plenty of support in place, and Jill and Lisa Bosley will be great resources on that front too. And then the important date is April 2nd. That's a little bit earlier than in previous years. I think previously it's always been like May 1st, early May. And the reason we decided to move it up a month is because, one, May 1st is a horrible time to have those be due, right? Because everything else is hitting the fan at that point. And two, this will give us time to get feedback. So if there's like a little issue or something, we can go ahead and nip that in the bud before the spring semester ends. Because I think what we found previously is that those emails go out over the summer if there's some issue and like nobody's checking their email, and then it gets pushed into the fall and nobody wants that. So I think this will just be better for everyone that it's a little bit earlier. And as I indicated before, a lot of folks have already submitted. So if you're in a situation where you haven't yet, you're having questions, feel free to ask me. You have my contact information, and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. So, are there any questions? I think we have like maybe a minute. Yeah, Deborah.
Is the gen ed report, is it at some point go forward to SACS?
It gets sort of included in the narrative that is written. So it's not like every individual report is going, but it will be part of the narrative.
Well, that's what's kind of throwing me, because from the workshop yesterday, the language we were told uses all past tense. And here some of your language is not, it's talking about how we're going to use this.
Yes.
Which is what, like, totally
Yeah.
opposite of what we were
I think the
instructed.
difference is we're entering the other stuff in track data. And
Okay.
Yes.
I think
That's
that's
what
how that
Yeah.
language
So
is
here
very.
we can talk about,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things, my sense of it, again, this is new to me, I'm new to the position, but my sense of it is that they do eventually want to standardize that more. So it's not like, okay, you're doing one thing for this assessment and a totally different thing for the other one. And that's why I mentioned documentation. I think that's coming for Gen Ed, not for this one, not for 2018, but for the probably 2020, they'll be asking for some sort of documentation. So it could be something as simple though as like, here's the instrument that we revised that was used for this round of assessment or something like that.
So for this one, while you're using all of your assessment data comes from last year, you're also wanting to include in it what you decided this year you're doing to change based on that assessment data.
That can be part of it, or if you already did something, so like the example I gave from first year writing, like so once all of those things were in place, it's like here's what we did to address this issue, and here's what we're seeing with the results. And so, so of course we saw that there was causation, right? So we made these changes and we saw an improvement with information literacy, for example. So yeah, so I think at this point, the language is still, you don't just always have to use past tense for this report. But I wouldn't be surprised if that changes. So, but again, for 2018, the expectation is you can use future tense if you've already got an idea for something that you're going to try based on the results. And sometimes, it could be something just like, we're going to offer more professional development opportunities where adjuncts participate in the assessment process or something like that. Okay. Thank you all so much for coming. It was nice to meet some new people. And if you have any questions after you leave here, feel free to email me.